Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Hacienda La Esmeralda Wash Process Panama from April Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And I'll turn the box aside so you can see the information as well. And April, based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel multiple times before. However, this is by far the most excited I've been to review one of their coffees, as not only is this a Hacienda La Esmeralda coffee, but it is also a non-Geisha Panamanian coffee. And as I've said in the past, I really enjoy reviewing non-Geisha Panamanian coffees, as not only are they hard to find these days, but I often feel that they're overshadowed by Panamanian Geishas. So anytime I find one, I do my best to review it, and I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So it's definitely on the lighter side of things, as April does roast on the lighter side of the spectrum. However, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is an uber light coffee. I feel like once upon a time I was told that April roasts on the very light side of that spectrum. I don't know if it's necessarily for this coffee that they didn't go quite as light. I'd still say that's a pretty light coffee, but once again, I wouldn't say that it's an extremely light coffee, just a moderately to pretty light cup of coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the coffee came out very nice, as not only was it sweet and clean, but there was an abundance of Central American characteristics in a very well-defined manner. Chocolate, caramel, nuts, and a very slight fruit complexity, but for the most part there was a bit of a lingering brightness with great body and an overall very positive first impression. So let me stop right there. And I was actually told when I purchased this box of coffee that this didn't sound like my type of coffee, and I said actually far to the contrary, this sounds extremely like my type of coffee, as I have very high standards and expectations for these ones specifically, because I'm expecting this tremendous clarity, this tremendous definition, and a lot of sweetness to it. And this first impression definitely yielded so many of those characteristics, and I can sacrifice a lot of the fruit components if I'm getting all of those things in very notable abundance, and that first impression definitely did yield so many of those characteristics. So we continue on to day 19, as we opted for the Chemex, and it was pretty similar, as it tasted like a very well-defined chocolate bar with a strong emphasis on the chocolate and nougat aspects. Very clean and sweet again, with a lingering brightness, and for the most part a very lovely cup of coffee. Definitely enjoyed these first two experiences with this one. So we continue on to day 22, as we opted for the April brewer, and fittingly it's the best that has been up to this point, and that's what you'd imagine given that the April brewer is made for their coffees, as it's skewed heavily in the direction of a very well-defined chocolate bar. And on this day, I'd say it was reminiscent for me of a cross between a Three Musketeers and a Snickers in such a clean sense, as it had some of the nutty components and the caramel components of the Snickers, while still offering that very strong nougat aspect, and of course there's chocolate components of the Three Musketeers, and the combination of the two is essentially what I was feeling from this coffee, mostly because of just how tremendous the definition was. And I do want to focus on that nougat-like aspect, because once again, it's a note they have listed on here, and it's something that was very defined within this coffee, especially on this day. Day 24, through the Chemex with April's recipe, and it still offered great sweetness, but it skewed a little bit more in the nutty direction, which isn't necessarily what I was going for. At this point, it was a little bit more reminiscent of a Snickers bar for me, so we're kind of trading between candy bars, and nuttiness isn't necessarily my favorite component, especially when it comes to these more classical, traditional coffees. So it was fine, just not necessarily quite as good, as I preferred the focus on that nougat chocolate-like sweetness in place of the nuttiness, but I still enjoyed this cup. Day 27 through the V60 with April's recipe, and the cup continues to lack that same sort of chocolate bar forward sweetness in place of a little bit more nutty forward of a cup. So that's why I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of their recipe for these coffees. Pretty clean and sweet nonetheless, with an ever so slight red fruit, but pretty solid altogether. Day 30, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the cup is back to the best it's been up to this point, as there's a heavier focus on the chocolate and nougat aspects yet again. And that's really what I wanted to hone in on and focus with this coffee, as it was reminiscent this time a little bit more of a Three Musketeers and somewhat of a Milky Way chocolate bar. Nuttiness is still present, but it was a fair bit more subtle. Brightness is also still lingering throughout as well. It's lingering, but it's not necessarily overly strong. It's just kind of in the background and pronounced ever so slightly, but even then it's on the more moderate side of things. Day 33 through the Chemex, and I actually had a very hard time picking between which brew method I enjoyed the most, as that one April day we opted for was extremely nice. The Chemex days were also turning out very nice, especially when we had our more standard recipe. And this day yielded that once again, as it had a very similar cup with the same recipe, offering a very clean candy bar-like aspect with emphasis on the chocolate, caramel, and listed nougat. Outside of that, there's notably less nuttiness and some very, very subtle fruits. And it offered a slight bit more clarity, and this is the trade-off, and it's a very slight trade-off. A little bit more clarity through the Chemex, and then of course, as you'd imagine, a little bit more intensity through the V60. So that's why I think I preferred the V60, as it had enough clarity to begin with. This is a very clean cup of coffee, and I didn't necessarily need that added layer of it. What I really wanted was an added layer and focus on those chocolate and nougat-like attributes. As on day 37, we tried the V60 one more time, and this is when it kind of sold me as this being my preferred brew method, as the listed nougat aspects are very well pronounced and defined in this cup. It seems to be improving with time as well, so here at this day 40 mark, I'm enjoying this coffee the most I've enjoyed it up to this point, which continues to demonstrate just how much it's opening up and improving with each day. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. So let's start with the cleanliness level 4. And kind of interesting to me, because I've said in the past that there are very few coffees that are non-geishas that can score that level 5. And I think we've only had one or maybe two the entire time that we've been doing these reviews that have scored that level 5, but this one right here is really, really close to it. And I'm not really too surprised given the combination of factors that are at play with this coffee. And I think the only reason I had to keep it at that level 4 was mostly because it didn't have that uber clean, uber just like very well-defined flavor profile that was reminiscent in so many other coffees. But I do have to say it's extremely close. And if somebody charted this at a level 5, I would not be mad for that, because given just how much definition there is in this coffee, how much clarity there is in this coffee, it would be more than justified. This is definitely on the higher side of level 4. Even with the Chemex, I feel like maybe you're going like a 4.4 to a 4.5. It's just that ever so slight bit of added clarity to the cup. But I don't know if I could necessarily bump it all the way up to the level 5 for me personally, mostly because there are some other coffees that are just super clean. And while this one is extremely clean, once again, not necessarily to that level, though definitely still that higher level 4. Finish, level 4, and I absolutely adored the finish in this coffee, as it continued to offer so many of those chocolate-like attributes to it in such a very well-defined manner, so massive credits to them on the finish for this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. This was a very sweet cup of coffee, and if I was being very generous, I could also bump this up to a level 5, as I wouldn't be too mad at anybody for pushing this all the way up to the level 5 mark, and it was very sweet in those candy bar-like aspects too. So for all of those reasons, definitely enjoyed the sweetness, definitely on the higher side of all that. Chocolate level 4. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anybody, as it's the first note I took away the very first time I tried this coffee, and it offers such a wonderful milk chocolate-like component. I don't recall whether or not that's the exact chocolate note that they had listed on here, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did, because given the chocolate-like aspect of this one in such a defined manner, I could say that it definitely justifies at minimum that level 4 mark. If anything, that's also pushing on the higher side of the level 4. Caramel, level 4. I wouldn't necessarily say it's quite as well defined as the chocolate attributes within this coffee, though it offered an extra level of sweetness and just a little bit more depth to this one. So level 4 seemed like a pretty good fit. I was also not entirely sure where I wanted to chart the nougat, but just keep it somewhere between those two characteristics, because once again, it's just a little bit more of that sweetness, and I think it kind of lumps those three things together. Then we have just one level 3 actually, and it's the body level 3. So it had a fair bit of texture, but maybe I might have expected a little bit more body. It is a Catuai. I should have said that right from the start. It's not a Gesha, so as you would expect, it's definitely going to have a little bit more body in that sense. In addition to that, it was brewed with the V60, so once again, that would say that it should have a little bit more body. So having it right there at that level 3, medium-bodied cup of coffee, I feel like that's a good placement for it. And then the florality level 3, I would say that it's not necessarily an overly defined floral aspect to it. It just kind of had that floral chocolate bar-like component to it. Yeah. And then the acidity level 2, I think I just kind of wanted to gloss over that florality because I was so curious about the acidity. I mentioned that the brightness is present, but it's so lingering, fleeting, and in the background. And I wanted to make notes of that every single time I experienced it because I might have expected this coffee to have way more brightness than it did, especially given what this coffee is. But it felt a little bit more toned down throughout the entirety of the time I was drinking them. And every time I wanted to experience that, I just really wanted to make a note of it so that it would be, well, noted that there's a little bit of brightness to it, but not to the same extent that I experienced with the vast majority of coffees. I honestly can't remember the last time we had a coffee score level 2 for acidity, as it doesn't really offer that too often throughout this one. So really wanted to discuss that in this tasting wheel. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's interestingly a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I absolutely adored this one, and this right here is the epitome of what I look for when it comes to crowd pleaser coffees, as it had all of the characteristics that I look for those coffees in such a clean, defined manner. And I think what will always set those crowd pleaser coffees apart for me is when they offer a very, very high level of clarity, and this one had that, and a very, very high level of sweetness. Because if you hit on those two marks, then I think it, for the most part, doesn't matter what the rest of what you do with this coffee is going to be. It's going to be a coffee that I very much enjoy. If you're skewing that even in a citric direction, it's very sweet and it's very clean, then I'm going to enjoy it. And this coffee being very clean and very sweet in a direction of this candy bar-like attribute, it just made it such an enjoyable coffee from start to finish. And that continues to show why I enjoy Panama as an origin just in general. It doesn't matter if it's a Gesha, it doesn't matter if it's non-Gesha. Every time I have one of these coffees, of course, if it's a washed, then I seem to just enjoy it way more than I would any of the other origin counterparts, as I imagine that this Catuai in almost any other origin probably isn't going to be as good. And that's a testament to just how much I enjoy Panamanian coffees and the amount of clarity and depth that they do offer. Also, it's a Hacienda La Esmeralda coffee, and a lot of people know I've adored that estate for, as long as I've been drinking coffee. That's one of my favorite places for coffee ever. So massive credit to everyone involved in this one. I found this to be a truly spectacular one. The only thing that's going to hold it back from finishing our top 10 coffees of 2024 list is the fact that it is in the Panama category. So it's going to be extremely hard for it to compete against those Geshas, against those other rare coffees. But even by that standard, I do have to say that as far as standard coffees go, crowd pleaser coffees, I think it's very hard to get any better than this one right here. And that transitions nicely into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you enjoy your crowd pleaser coffees, but you also want them in a more sweet and clean manner, this right here has that in significant abundance, as I always like to point these ones towards maybe people that have a very specific preference for, we'll just say, more modern coffees, but still also want something that they can drink every single day. I could drink this coffee every single day, and I would not be disappointed by that, because while it's not offering any of those wild, intense fruit components, those wild, intense floral components, it just sticks to the true basics that really make a lot of these kind of traditional coffees very special, and it's done in such a wonderful manner that it made it a very enjoyable coffee throughout, and anybody that enjoys those traditional crowd pleaser coffees, I feel like would really enjoy this one a lot as well. I think for the most part, that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Hacienda La Esmeralda wash process Panama from April Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.